It began not with a public statement, but with a sealed envelope, one delivered quietly from the late Queen Elizabeth II's private red box into the hands of Princess Catherine. But what unfolded in that moment sent a ripple of shock through palace corridors, because standing just feet away, Queen Camilla realized something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What should have been a controlled, almost ceremonial reading instead carried a tension that insiders would later describe as suffocating, the kind that settles in silence before something breaks. The room itself remained guarded not just by protocol but by expectation, because this was not merely a reading of a will, it was the final voice of a monarch whose decisions had shaped decades of stability. Reports suggest that only a tightly controlled circle had been permitted inside. King Charles III, visibly strained and measured Prince William, standing with a quiet intensity that hinted at something already understood, and Catherine, whose composure masked the gravity of what she was about to receive. Camilla, however, stood on the edge of that moment with a different expectation entirely, because for years, her position beside Charles had not only elevated her status but, in many interpretations, placed her within reach of legacy itself. And yet, as the document was opened and its contents began to unfold, the subtle shift in attention toward Catherine, toward William, toward a future that suddenly felt predetermined became impossible to ignore. Palace aides, usually quick to manage even the smallest ripple of uncertainty, remained unusually restrained, as if instructed in advance that whatever happened inside that room was not to leave it in words, only in consequence. Those familiar with royal administrative customs would later whisper that such silence was never accidental, that it often signaled decisions too significant to be debated in real time. Early murmurs began to surface almost immediately, not through official channels but through the quiet networks that exist behind palace walls, suggesting that the distribution outlined in the will did not follow the expected lines of balance or tradition. Instead, it hinted at something far more deliberate, a restructuring of legacy that placed Catherine not at the periphery, but firmly at the center. And it was in that realization, subtle yet undeniable, that Camilla's stillness began to carry a different meaning, not patience, not composure, but the first visible sign that whatever she had anticipated was slipping beyond reach. The atmosphere grew heavier with each passing second, not because of what was said openly, but because of what no one dared to say aloud. A shared awareness that the monarchy's internal balance had just shifted in a way that could not be easily undone. And as the final lines of the document settled into silence, the weight of that shift became impossible to ignore, leaving behind a tension that refused to dissipate. But what that document revealed wasn't just unexpected, it was a calculated decision that would ignite one of the most explosive internal confrontations the monarchy had seen in decades. The will was never meant to be ordinary, but no one anticipated just how decisive it would be, or who it would ultimately elevate. What began as a quiet continuation of that sealed moment quickly transformed into something far heavier, something rooted not just in personal decisions but in centuries of calculated preservation. Because within the House of Windsor, inheritance has never been about sentiment alone, it has always been about survival. And as the contents of Queen Elizabeth II's final directive began to settle into understanding, it became clear that this was not simply a division of assets, but a deliberate restructuring of power itself. Reports suggest the will outlined a precise distribution of estates, jewels, and deeply symbolic holdings, those rare possessions that carry not just monetary value, but historical authority, carefully assigning them in a way that reinforced continuity rather than comfort. The estates, long viewed as the physical backbone of royal legacy, were not scattered or softened in their allocation. Instead, they were anchored with intent, tied to the future rather than the present. The jewels, often misunderstood as mere ornaments, were treated as markers of legitimacy, passed along lines that signaled trust and responsibility rather than proximity or status. And perhaps most striking of all were the symbolic holdings, those intangible elements of the monarchy that cannot be measured in wealth but define its very identity, which appeared to have been concentrated in a way that elevated Princess Catherine into a role far greater than many had anticipated. Insiders whisper that this structure was no accident, that the late monarch had long viewed her final will as a protective instrument, a last safeguard designed to secure the institution against internal fragmentation at a time when its stability could no longer be taken for granted. Within that framework, Catherine's positioning began to make sense not as favoritism, but as alignment with a vision that prioritized discipline, continuity, and quiet strength. Meanwhile, interpretations of the allocations tied to Queen Camilla painted a far more restrained picture, suggesting that what she received carried more symbolic acknowledgement than structural influence, a distinction that, within royal dynamics, speaks louder than any public statement ever could. For someone whose presence had gradually become intertwined with the crown's modern identity, the implications of such a shift were impossible to ignore, because it subtly but unmistakably redefined her place within that structure. And yet, those familiar with the monarchy's long history would recognize a familiar pattern in this decision, one that echoes through generazione pattern where legacy is protected not by equal distribution, but by strategic concentration, where the future is secured by placing trust in those seen as capable of carrying it forward without compromise. That is what made this will so profound and so unsettling, because it did not simply reflect the past it attempted to control what came next. But if the will was meant to secure the future, it also triggered something far more immediate and far more volatile. Those present would later describe the moment as unlike anything seen before, because composure gave way to something raw, public, and impossible to contain. What had begun as a controlled and almost ritualistic unfolding of Queen Elizabeth II's final wishes suddenly shifted into something far more volatile, as the weight of those decisions settled unevenly across the room, and for Queen Camilla, the weight did not land quietly. Reports suggest that the first signs were subtle expression tightening, a pause that stretched just a moment too long, but within seconds, those small fractures gave way to something unmistakable, a reaction fueled not just by surprise, but by disbelief that what she had anticipated for years had been so decisively rewritten. Insiders whisper that her response was immediate and unfiltered, a rare break from the composure expected at the highest levels of royal protocol, as the implications of the will became impossible to ignore. Because this was never just about material inheritance, it was about standing, about influence, about the unspoken hierarchy that governs everything behind palace walls. And in that moment, the shift was undeniable. The focus had moved, the structure had changed, and with it came the realization that her position, carefully built over time beside King Charles III, was no longer anchored in the way she believed it to be. Tension escalated quickly, not through raised voices alone, but through the kind of charged silence that follows words spoken too directly, as claims of fairness and expectation began to surface, each one carrying years of assumption behind it. Those familiar with the dynamics of the royal household would later suggest that what unfolded was not a sudden reaction, but the release of something long held beneath the surface, a growing sense that recognition and reward had not aligned with contribution. That proximity to the crown had not translated into the legacy it seemed to promise. And yet, within that space, another reality was quietly taking hold, one that stood in stark contrast to the intensity of her response. Princess Catherine remained composed, not detached, but grounded, absorbing the magnitude of what had been placed upon her without outward reaction, a stillness that only seemed to deepen the divide unfolding in real time. That contrast did not go unnoticed. Palace staff, trained to anticipate even the slightest disruption, found themselves unprepared for the scale of what they were witnessing, caught between maintaining protocol and navigating a moment that refused to be contained within it. Some accounts suggest attempts were made to redirect the conversation, to restore order before the situation moved beyond control, but the emotional stakes had already been set in motion, and once that line had been crossed, there was no easy return. Because for Camilla, this was not simply a disagreement, it was a confrontation with a reality that challenged everything she believed her role had become. A realization that the legacy she stood within did not guarantee the legacy she would inherit. And as the room struggled to regain its balance, that realization lingered, heavy and unresolved. Because what had been exposed was not just a reaction, but a fracture in expectation itself, one that would not quietly disappear, but instead continue to echo through every decision that followed, making it clear that this wasn't just about emotion, it was about power, and what happens when that power suddenly shifts. Because behind what looked like a personal choice was something far more deliberate as strategy years in the making. What had just unfolded in that room was not an emotional decision, nor a spontaneous redistribution of legacy, but the culmination of a vision that Queen Elizabeth II had been quietly shaping long before her final days, on a vision rooted in one unshakable principle that the monarchy must endure, even if individuals within it must adjust, retreat, or be repositioned. Reports suggest that in the later years of her reign, as pressures mounted from both public scrutiny and internal tensions, she began to view her final will not simply as a legal document, but as a stabilizing force, a carefully constructed safeguard designed to preserve the institution against fragmentation. And within that framework, every decision carried weight beyond the present moment. Because this was never about who deserved more or less, it was about who could carry the burden without destabilizing what had been built over generations. That is where Princess Catherine's role begins to take on deeper meaning, not as a sudden elevation, but as the result of years of quiet observation, a steady alignment with protocol, restraint, and an understanding of duty that did not seek attention but earned trust. Insiders whisper that Catherine's strength was never defined by assertion, but by consistency, by her ability to navigate the complexities of royal life without becoming entangled in its internal rivalries, making her, in many interpretations, the safest anchor for a future that demanded unity over division. At the same time, there were growing concerns, subtle at first, but increasingly difficult to ignore, about the influence of competing factions within the royal household, dynamics that risked shifting the monarchy's focus away from its core purpose and toward personal networks of power. Those familiar with these internal currents suggest that the late Queen was acutely aware of how quickly influence could reshape perception, and how perception, in turn, could weaken the very foundation she had spent her life protecting. Within that context, the will begins to read less like a distribution of assets and more like a recalibration of authority, one that quietly reinforced alignment with Prince William's future reign, ensuring that the transition ahead would not be complicated by competing claims or divided loyalties. Because William's path was never meant to stand alone, it required a counterpart capable of reinforcing its direction. And in Catherine, that counterpart had already been recognized. Meanwhile, the implications for Queen Camilla became part of that same calculation, not as a rejection but as a limitation, a careful narrowing of influence that reflected a broader concern about balance, rather than a personal judgment. And it is in that balance that the true weight of this strategy reveals itself, because the will did something few expected: at extended control beyond the Queen's lifetime, shaping outcomes not through presence, but through design, a final assertion of authority that continued to operate even in absence. This was not just legacy, it was governance from beyond, a silent but decisive hand ensuring that the monarchy would move forward along a path already chosen, but even if those within it had not yet fully understood it. But strategy on paper is one thing, consequences in real time are something entirely different. Within hours, the atmosphere inside the palace had changed, and not quietly. What had once been held together by routine and unspoken understanding began to fracture under the weight of what had just been revealed. And the shift was felt not in dramatic announcements, but in the subtle, unmistakable tension that moved through every corridor, every conversation, every carefully measured glance. Reports suggest that lines began to form almost immediately, not formally declared but deeply understood, as the royal household adjusted to a new reality that had not been anticipated by everyone within it. On one side, there was a quiet consolidation of alignment around Princess Catherine and Prince William, a recognition that the future direction of the monarchy had been signaled with unusual clarity. On the other, there was a growing sense of displacement surrounding Queen Camilla, whose reaction had not only exposed the depth of her expectations, but had also made it impossible to ignore the shift in her standing. Insiders whisper that interactions between Camilla and senior members of the family became increasingly strained, not always through open confrontation, but through the kind of restrained distance that speaks louder than any disagreement, where every word is weighed and every silence carries meaning. At the center of this tightening divide stood King Charles III, caught in a position that few could navigate without consequence, balancing his role as monarch with the personal loyalties that had defined much of his life. Those familiar with his position suggest that the pressure was immediate and unrelenting, because this was not simply a matter of resolving disagreement, it was about maintaining stability at a moment when stability itself felt uncertain. His attempts to mediate, subtle and carefully measured, reflected a deeper struggle, one that required him to acknowledge the authority of the decision while managing the emotional fallout it had triggered. Meanwhile, Catherine's composure remained unbroken, not as an act of indifference, but as a deliberate choice to uphold the very principles that had guided the outcome, even as scrutiny intensified around her. That composure, however, only seemed to heighten the contrast, reinforcing the perception that a transition was already underway, one that extended beyond titles and into influence itself. Behind the scenes, efforts to contain the narrative moved quickly, with palace aides working to ensure that what had occurred remained within controlled boundaries, aware that even the smallest leak could transform internal tension into public spectacle. Yet despite those efforts, speculation began to build, carried through the quiet but persistent channels that connect the monarchy to the outside world. Royal commentators, long attuned to the slightest shift in tone or behavior, started to question what had changed, why it had changed, and what it meant for the future. And as those questions grew louder, the palace found itself navigating not just an internal divide, but an external curiosity that could not be easily dismissed, because the story unfolding behind closed doors carried implications far beyond those walls, leaving one critical uncertainty lingering beneath it all, unresolved and increasingly impossible to ignore. But while the palace worked to contain the damage, the deeper question remained unanswered. Through it all, one figure remained notably composed, watching, calculating, and saying very little. While tension rippled through the palace and reactions unfolded in ways few had anticipated, Prince William held his position with a stillness that carried far more weight than any immediate response could have. Reports suggest that his silence was not hesitation but intention, a deliberate choice. To observe before acting, to understand the full scope of what had been set into motion by the final wishes of Queen Elizabeth II. Those familiar with his approach describe it as measured, almost strategic, rooted in an awareness that moments like this do not require noise, they require control. And within that control, a quiet alignment began to emerge, one that did not need to be announced to be understood. His stance, subtle yet unmistakable, reinforced the direction already outlined, placing his support firmly behind Princess Catherine and the role she had now been entrusted to carry. That reinforcement did not come through grand declarations, but through presence, through the absence of doubt, through the quiet signals that ripple outward in environments where every movement is interpreted. Insiders whisper that behind closed doors, his influence became increasingly apparent, not through confrontation, but through guidance, shaping the response in ways that prioritized stability over reaction, continuity over disruption. Because for William, this was not just about responding to a moment, it was about preparing for what came next, about ensuring that the monarchy did not lose its footing during a transition that was already more fragile than it appeared. And in that preparation, a broader shift began to take form, one that extended beyond individuals and into the structure of the institution itself. The idea of a generational change, long discussed in quiet terms, suddenly felt immediate, no longer a distant inevitability but a process already unfolding in real time. Catherine's position, once viewed as supportive, now carried a different weight, becoming central to a vision that emphasized discipline, restraint, and a return to principles that could anchor the monarchy in uncertain times. Meanwhile, King Charles III's role appeared increasingly complex, as the balance between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility grew more difficult to maintain, leaving space for William's steady presence to take on greater significance. It was not a shift marked by conflict, but by contrast, a quiet transfer of influence that revealed itself through consistency rather than declaration. And perhaps that is what made it so powerful, because it did not demand attention, it earned it, gradually, inevitably, until it could no longer be ignored. In the midst of uncertainty, William's approach offered something the palace desperately needed: clarity without confrontation, authority without force, direction without disruption. And as that clarity began to settle into the fabric of the institution, it became increasingly evident that what had occurred was not an isolated incident, but part of something larger, something already shaping the future in ways that could not be reversed, leaving behind a realization that carried both certainty and consequence. But as the dust began to settle, it became clear this wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point. Because what had unfolded wasn't just about inheritance, it was about redefining the very meaning of the crown itself. What began as a moment of private revelation had now expanded into something far greater, something that reached beyond individuals and into the very identity of the monarchy, reshaping how power, duty, and legacy were understood within its walls. Reports suggest that the decisions laid out in Queen Elizabeth II's final will carry a message that could not be ignored, one that moved away from the idea of entitlement and toward a far more rigid principle that the crown is not owned, it is carried. And in that shift, the contrast became undeniable. For years, proximity to the throne had often been interpreted as a pathway to influence, but what this moment revealed was far more restrictive, far more controlled, reinforcing the idea that access does not equal authority, and presence does not guarantee permanence. At the center of that realization stood Princess Catherine, whose rise now symbolized something deeper than elevation. It reflected continuity, a steady alignment with the expectations that had long defined the monarchy's survival. Insiders whisper that Catherine's strength lies not in dominance, but in discipline, in her ability to absorb responsibility without reshaping it for personal gain, making her not just a recipient of legacy, but a vessel for it. And as that perception began to solidify, the influence of competing factions within the royal household appeared to diminish, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. As the direction of the institution became increasingly clear, those who once operated within shifting networks of influence found themselves facing a different reality, one where alignment mattered more than access, and where the boundaries of power were no longer fluid, but firmly defined. Beyond the palace, this shift did not go unnoticed. Public perception, often shaped by speculation, narrative, began to respond to the clarity emerging from within, as royal commentators and observers started to reinterpret what had taken place, not as a dramatic redistribution, but as a reaffirmation of purpose. Because the will itself was no longer being viewed as a simple document, it had become a statement, a deliberate expression of intent that reached beyond the moment of its reading and into the future it sought to secure. And in that expression, there was something both reassuring and unsettling, a reminder that the monarchy, for all its modern pressures, still operates on principles that resist change, that demand sacrifice, and that ultimately prioritize the institution above all else. For some, that realization reinforced confidence, offering a sense of stability in uncertain times. For others, it raised questions about the cost of that stability, about who is elevated and who is left behind in the process. But regardless of interpretation, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. The crown had been redefined not by what was given, but by what was withheld, by the lines that had been drawn and the message they carried. And yet, even with that clarity beginning to take shape, something remained unresolved, a quiet tension beneath the surface that refused to fully settle, because and yet, even with clarity emerging, one final truth lingered beneath it all. In the end, it wasn't about who wanted power, but who had been entrusted with it long before the final decision was ever revealed. What had unfolded inside those guarded walls was not a sudden shift or an emotional reaction frozen in time, but the closing chapter of a plan that had been set in motion long before anyone present fully understood its reach. Reports suggest that Queen Elizabeth II's final move was never meant to comfort, it was meant to endure, to extend her authority beyond her lifetime and anchor the monarchy in a direction that could not be easily altered. Because within the structure she left behind, every decision carried a deeper intention, one that positioned the crown not as a possession to be claimed, but as a responsibility to be carried with discipline, restraint, and unwavering commitment. That is where the true weight of this moment begins to settle, because it reveals a monarchy that does not bend to personal ambition, no matter how close that ambition stands to its center. Instead, it reinforces a system where trust is earned over time and secured, and through consistency, not assumed through proximity. At the heart of that system now stands Princess Catherine, stepping into a role that was never simply handed to her. but shaped around her, defined by expectations that demand more than presence, they demand endurance. Insiders whisper that her position represents more than elevation, it symbolizes a continuation of the values that have quietly sustained the monarchy through its most uncertain periods, a steady force in a structure that cannot afford instability. And yet, within that same moment of clarity lies a contrasting reality, one that cannot be ignored. For Queen Camilla, the shift has been undeniable, not just in perception but in influence, as the space she once occupied begins to narrow in ways that are subtle but deeply consequential. What was once seen as a secure position now carries a different weight, one defined by limitation rather than expansion, forcing an adjustment that few at that level ever anticipate. Those familiar with the internal dynamics of the monarchy suggest that such transitions are rarely abrupt, but they are always decisive, unfolding over time until the new structure becomes impossible to challenge. And it is within that unfolding that the monarchy itself begins to take on a new form, one that is more controlled, more deliberate, and perhaps more guarded than before. Because what this moment has ultimately revealed is not just a redistribution of legacy, but a reaffirmation of control, a reminder that the institution remains larger than any individual within it. The crown, as it stands now, is not shaped by desire, but by design, by a vision that extends beyond the present and into a future that has already been quietly outlined. And as that vision settles into place, it leaves behind a sense of finality that cannot be easily undone, because once the balance has shifted, it does not return to what it once was. That is the true significance of what has taken place, not the reaction, not the conflict, but the permanence of the outcome, a legacy secured not through consensus, but through certainty, leaving no room for reversal, no space for reconsideration, only the quiet acceptance of a path already chosen, because in the House of Windsor, legacy is never given lightly, and once decided, it rarely leaves room for second chances. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.